Okay, in the last video we talked about how the spread of machinery and new factory technology like the assembly line started to change things, and we also started to touch in on how America is going to become an early leader. The assembly line and interchangeable parts are a big part of it. Let's move on now to sciences. So during this time period, we're also going to see revolutions. So far we've had political revolutions, work revolutions, industrial revolutions, but now we're going to see revolutions in science. People were already starting to work with science before during the Enlightenment. We talked about vivisections and autopsies, and people were learning more about how the body worked. We're just continuing that evolution. But during this time period, we have some really big changes, some big revolutions on the way we view the scientific world. And that's the next part. So science gave us machines. What else can it give us now, right? That's the next logical step. We're seeing what else we can keep questioning with. So people began working with chemicals more. The Germans are really going to take off with this later on, and we'll talk about their work later, especially in the early 20th century. Originally, a lot of the first chemical work was done to find better dyes. Dyes like for clothing, right? And remember, textiles are going to be the big leader for a lot of this. But to find better dyes and to find more artificial colorings and stuff. But eventually, that chemical research starts working into other later medicine and other chemical understandings. So the birth kind of chemistry and moving away from the old chemistry, which was alchemy. Some of the first big changes that are going to come out, now there's tons of them, but we're only going to talk about a couple of the major ones. One of the first big changes is anesthesia, which some of you have probably had before. If you've ever had surgery where you had to be put under, put to sleep or have that surgery so that you're not awake and screaming in pain and terror as they cut into you, or if you've ever had teeth, work on your teeth done and they've numbed your mouth, that's anesthesia. It's basically preventing the pain for you. So painless surgery is now an option for people. That's huge. Remember before when we talked about vivisections and doctors were learning about how the human body worked, they did that without any pain medication, without putting people to sleep. Now, for the first time ever, if you're wounded on the battlefield or if you need dental work, you can actually do it without screaming in agony. That's to me a huge game changer. Next, Louis Pasteur, and you've probably heard of Pasteur before, or pasteurization. Your gallon of milk in the fridge probably says pasteurization on it. Louis Pasteur is famous for pasteurization, but also coming up with germ theory. The idea that germs cause disease, which is something you learned probably in kindergarten or before, probably preschool. You've learned that there's little things that you can't see that cause diseases, and in today's world, obviously, that's a big topic right now. But the idea that little germs, we're not quite at understanding viruses or bacteria yet, but the idea that there's things that we can't see that are all around us and they actually cause the diseases, that was a big shift. Remember, for most of history, people got sick because witches did it, or you were cursed by Satan. There's all sorts of weird theories. Apollo's arrows, I think that's what the Greeks called it. They believed you were struck by the gods. So this is a huge shift. It's no longer something that we can't understand. We can understand this. Germs, little bugs, are what cause us to get sick. That's a huge game changer right there, because now all of a sudden, if we know that there's something that can make us get sick, we can fight it. We can prevent it. We can wash our hands. We can use things to clean our bodies and prevent contact with these germs. So with Louis Pasteur, germ theory, the idea that these little things cause us to get sick, and that's a big shift in human thought, and it's going to obviously save millions of lives. We're not quite at antibiotics yet. Those things are going to come later, but we're moving towards that idea that we can actually fight these diseases with science. Next up is then, if you can understand germ theory and that there are germs, antiseptics are created to kill germs. Alcohol is one of the easiest ones, and that's going to be used for a lot of the first cleaning uses. So antiseptics are going to save literally millions of lives. This is not part of the class, but there is a Polish doctor. I cannot pronounce his name. I believe his last name was Simmelweis. He was a Polish doctor who is one of the first proponents of hand washing. At his hospital, he forced all of the doctors at his hospital to wash their hands after doing autopsies. So if you were working on a dead body, you would have to wash your hands, especially before delivering babies. At first, all the doctors thought he was ridiculous. They thought he was insane, and they told him this, and they basically were very dismissive of his beliefs that germs were causing these diseases. They thought that there was no link between touching dead bodies and then delivering babies. But what they actually found is in the hospital that when they enforced this hand washing protocol, that the rate of infant mortality plummeted. However, Semmelweis still faced a lot of discrimination in his life. Even though he was correct, he still faced a lot of discrimination. He also had some mental health issues. He ended up going to being put into a mental health asylum where he was then beaten to death later on. So pretty tragic life for there. But he was one of the first doctors that actually proposed that we should wash our hands. Seems ridiculous that that man had to then die in a mental hospital. Part of the reason why is being egged on by other doctors, and he was right, but that's the case it was. Something we take for granted today was not accepted even by the medical authority about 150 years ago. By the medical authorities, that's crazy. Um, but that's the world. Moving on. Other sciences start to develop as well too, and you've probably heard of Marie Curie before. There's an element named after her, obviously. She's very famous. Marie Curie and her husband were studying radioactivity. Now, tragically, they were studying radioactivity, especially radium. It can glow, but they didn't understand, and they were trying to understand how it works and the properties of radioactivity. However, they didn't understand the dangers of it. And you've possibly heard before in your life that her laboratory and her desk and her papers and the door handle, everything that she touched and everything that they worked on is still to this day incredibly radioactive. She and her husband eventually died from it, from radioactive exposure. So it's obviously very dangerous, but her work with radioactivity is eventually going to lead to the first X-ray machines. Her daughter, I believe, also drove an ambulance in World War One using X-ray machines too. I believe it was her daughter. I have to look that up again. But anyways, amazing work, saved many lives. Unfortunately, it ended up costing her her own life. Another scientist, this guy is a monk, Gregor Mendel. He was a Catholic monk, and he was really into botany, especially pea plants. He really enjoyed planting peas and then growing them and studying them, but he started to notice that some pea plants were yellow and some were white. I believe it was yellow and white, maybe it was green. Not important. They had different colors. So he's growing these pea plants, and he realizes that some of them have different colors, and he realizes that if he cross-pollinates just the one color with the same color, then the offspring of those plants, or the next generation of the pea plants, will only be that color. So let's say he crosses yellow with yellow, the next ones will be most likely yellow all the way down. And he can do that for generation to generation. He then also learned that he could take some pollen from one of the pea plants and mix it with another one, and then you could have like 50-50 chance of being one color or the other. This kind of, and in junior high you usually do Punnett squares and that sort of stuff. This is basically the birth of that. The idea that there is hereditary genes passed on. Doesn't understand genetics yet, didn't know the double helix or any of that stuff yet, but he's observing and studying. This is some early science, and basically coming down with the laws of heredity. The idea is that we pass on our genes. People have always kind of known this. If you're taller, your children are probably taller. We've always kind of known this, but now we're actually putting it down with science and observable facts and saying that this is something that's actually happening. The work of these two people is very rudimentary compared to nuclear scientists today and genetics research today, obviously. But Marie Curie and Gregor Mendel, their work, even though it seems really pretty basic for a lot of stuff you learn in junior high now, was groundbreaking for the time. Oh, one other thing. I do also like that, like Gregor Mendel was a Catholic monk, but he was also foundation for genetics. A lot of times we've talked about this before. We like to think that religion and science are directly opposed to each other. That's not true. That's not true for most of history. So. All right, moving on. So new social science is coming out. So different type of science. Excuse me. You've probably heard of Charles Darwin before and Darwinism. Let's talk about that and hopefully clear up some misunderstandings about it. So Charles Darwin sailed around the world on the Beagle, his ship, and not his ship, but he was a ship's doctor, and he was studying nature. So his idea was he wanted to learn as much as he could about all sorts of different animals. His main focus turns out to be around this island off the coast of Ecuador. It's owned by Ecuador today, called the Galapagos. You've probably heard of Galapagos turtle or tortoises and things like that before. It's a part of the world that's kind of isolated. It was connected at one point, but now it's isolated, and so you can see the different changes that have happened as the genes were passed down generation to generation. And he noticed that some animals seem to have different adaptations based off where they were. They may be similar, so the animals in the Galapagos may have been similar in some respects to the animals of Ecuador and the rest of South America, but they were different in other ways. So what he's basically building off of Mendel's idea. Mendel says, well, we pass down our genes. Well, Darwin's going to say that, yes, we pass down our genes, but some genes don't take, right? So let's say you pass down genes and it does not help you. It basically hurts you in some way. makes you less likely to get food, makes you less likely to survive, which makes you less likely to pass your own genes on to the next generation. This is what's the basis of evolution. So sometimes there's weird tweaks in genetic codes. It doesn't transfer 100%. It's not a carbon copy. And so sometimes there's improvements and sometimes there's disadvantages. And if you have a genetic improvement, then you survive. You get more food and you're more likely to pass on your genes. If you have a genetic failure, it goes the other way. That's the basic idea of Darwinism. And he's just applying this to nature. He was a biologist. He was studying biology. He was studying animals and plants. One of the most famous examples, if you want to look up something a little further, is Darwin's finch, which is a type of bird that has a fairly malleable genetic code, and it relates to the size of their beaks. Birds that have the finch, it's the same bird, but they look really different. Sometimes they have really big beaks. Those birds are more successful when food is not as plentiful and they have to eat bigger seeds that are harder to crack. Sometimes, but those big beaks require a little bit more energy. When food is plentiful, the same finch, but the same birds, the ones that have smaller beaks, are more likely to survive, and they can eat using less energy. They can eat a lot more of the smaller seeds. When there's a lot more smaller seeds available, they have more access to food, and those finches are more successful. And as a result, the next generation of birds have smaller beaks. When there's less food, the next generation have bigger beaks because of the bigger beak birds being more successful. So Darwin's finches is a famous example. You can look it up. I'm sure you'll find somebody who explains it better than I do. But that's basically the idea of evolution. Now, he was studying biology. He was studying the changes that take place generation to generation, and he's looking at a large scale. He says these things take thousands of generations, perhaps, in order to see changes. It's not all animals are like dogs, where within a couple of generations you see massive changes in dog DNA, and shapes and stuff like that, and hairstyles. He was saying it takes a long time for most things. He also says that you should not apply his ideas to society. So what do people do? Immediately apply his ideas to society. And this leads into some of the worst stuff that we're ever going to have to talk about, unfortunately. And it's still with us to this day. So social Darwinism excuse me, social Darwinism is taking the idea of Darwin, taking the ideas of Darwin, the idea that we pass on genes and that some genes are more successful than others, but now applying it to people and to humans, and not just like children, like the next generation. We're applying it to all aspects of society. Social Darwinism is not Darwin, okay? This is not his work. The biggest, you don't need to know his name really for this class, but the biggest proponent of social Darwinism is a British man named Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer, today we look back and say, wow, he was a terrible racist and classist. Great sideburns, look him up, had great sideburns, but horrible racist. But social Darwinism is taking the idea that some people have better genes and are more likely to survive, and some people have poorer genes and should die out, essentially. So social Darwinism is the idea that the rich are more adapted than the poor to survive. If you truly believe that concept, then there is nothing you can do to help the poor. There is nothing you can ever do to help the poor other than help them die off. They are poor because they are genetically inferior and that they will never improve. Rich people are survivors, that they are better. Herbert Spencer coined this term, and you've probably heard it, and you've probably heard it applied to Darwin, but Herbert Spencer coined the phrase survival of the fittest. The idea that the people who are most fit to survive are the ones who will survive. That's not really Darwinism, that's social Darwinism, that's Herbert Spencer, that's his quote. So the idea that some people are more fit to survive. Well, okay, you can apply that to class then. If you're a British industrialist and you're incredibly wealthy, you look at other people and say, well, I'm rich because I'm genetically superior. And you feel scientifically validated by it. You feel like, hey, I can obviously prove it. I've got a giant bank account, therefore my genes must be correct. And my children will be rich because they are also genetically superior. And if you're poor, then that's your fault. Keeping in that vein, British economists around the same time, Ricardo, he came up with the iron law of wages, that you should only pay poor people just enough to survive. Because if you pay them any more than that, they're more likely to have more children, and those children will just be poor people, so you're keeping that problem going. This is a pretty rough way to view the world, and mostly move past this. At least on face, we say that this is a wrong philosophy. Of course, many people still believe this to this day. Now, applying social Darwinism, let's take it out of like one country. Let's take it out of England. You could look at it as rich versus poor, but a lot of people are also then going to apply it to the rest of the world. And social Darwinism is going to encourage a lot of racism and a lot of the racist beliefs that we still deal with to this day. Global racism. So Europeans, and this is going to be an important concept, it's going to be with us all through imperialism and then into World War One and Two, unfortunately. So Europeans industrialized, the Americans industrialized, who are largely European descent, and so many Europeans and Americans started to have this belief that they were genetically superior to the other races of the world, totally ignoring the fact that China and the Middle East were leading the world technologically for thousands of years. Now, because Europeans industrialized, they must be genetically superior. So the white race, and this is where we're getting a lot of this racism stuff, is starting to develop. The white race is the superior race and is more adapted than the rest of the world. Social Darwinism is going to lead to things like scientific racism, which is not scientific, but is racist. They're going to have all sorts of these crazy ideas, and Europeans are going to justify their actions conquering the rest of the world because they are the genetically superior race. The British Empire is going to have this belief. A lot of times we credit it to Hitler, and no doubt the Nazis were social Darwinists. They fully believed it and were very open about it. The British Empire, though, same ideas. And the American Empire also had a lot of the same ideas. Next year, when you learn about an APUS and you learn about conquests of the West and Native Americans and the policies we had conquering the Native American people, that was based around social Darwinistic concepts. And this was a belief that was with us, unfortunately, for a long time period, and we're still kind of dealing with it today. Moving on. And we'll talk more about social Darwinism later. Last slide for this section right now, and then we'll move on to the next one. The growth of the middle class. So not everyone was super poor, and not everyone was super rich. There was now a new growth of the middle class. We've already talked about the bourgeoisie before. A lot of those early bourgeoisie people are going to rise up and become factory owners and the people at the very top rungs of society. However, now there's a new middle class. Now there's a class of people who are, just a mark below the upper class, the super upper class. But they're also not living in slums. These are people who worked as supervisors or machinists or accountants. People who had what we today would maybe call a white collar job. People who weren't doing the lowest rung jobs, but also weren't owning the factory. So these new people who made sure everything worked. This middle class of people had usually shorter work days. They didn't have to work 12, 14-hour days. They had better pay. They lived better houses. These new cities, which were developing around factories, were developing better entertainment and better culture, and largely targeting them. As this group of people starts to grow, remember, there's only so many people at the very top rung of society. It's a very small group. But this group of people starts to grow and get bigger and bigger. They start to have bigger demands. Music, art, theaters, museums, sports. This is where organized sports become a thing. For most of human history, there was no football, baseball, basketball, soccer. None of that existed because there was nobody to go watch the games, and also we didn't have the human concentration. We didn't have enough people to go and watch the games. But now we're starting to see stadiums develop and sports teams develop. If you look at how old most sports are, that you're familiar with at least, they're not that old. It's largely during this time period as the middle class started to develop. And there's people who work their job as a supervisor at a factory, get off their job and want to have something to do. These people had better homes, better education, they sent their kids to better schools than have ever existed, and life is pretty good for the middle class. So this new group of people. However, this new middle class also had a lot of time to devote to thinking about social and political issues, and so we're going to see some new changes and new philosophies coming from this class of people who have more time to devote to thought, essentially. And we're going to see new social sciences coming up, and that'll be the next thing we talk about.